You're listening to Stories from the Presbyterian Pew. This podcast is a resource of Advocacy from the Presbyterian Pew, a 501c3 nonprofit dedicated to educating lay people in the PCA, the Presbyterian Church in America, about PCA church government and process. On our website, we offer free, self-paced courses to help you understand the Book of Church Order, the BCO. These courses cover how the BCO works in theory, but what does it actually look like in practice? Stories from the Presbyterian Pew gives you an opportunity to hear directly from those who have walked through or observed what happens when the wheels of church process are set in motion. The stories we share are all true and all happened in PCA churches. All names and place names have been changed to protect the identities of the storytellers and others who play a role in their stories. Our goal is to facilitate understanding and awareness. Think of these stories as case studies, embodied and brought alive by the voices of our storytellers. As promised, I'm back from General Assembly and got some thoughts and reflections on the week, and I'm excited to be joined by a very special guest. I drove from Virginia to Louisville, Kentucky for General Assembly with my daughter, Ruth. Ruth is 18 and she just graduated from high school in May, and it was a delight for her to accompany me to General Assembly and just to be able to debrief with her about all that transpired. So I thought you would enjoy hearing her perspective as well as mine. So thanks for joining me, Ruth.
Thank you for having me, Mother.
As I've done in past years, I put together a post with highlights from General Assembly, and this is basically just a list of all of the major reports and debates that happened on the live stream with time-stamped links to exactly the right place in the recording so that you can go see it for yourself. So as we reference various things throughout this episode, if you'd like to see it, you can check that highlights post for the link. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time in this episode explaining how General Assembly and all of its committees work or going into details about each of the overtures. If you want some background on that, I recommend the 3 previous episodes that I did leading up to General Assembly. A bit of a spoiler I'm going to give you up front. If I had to summarize this year at General Assembly, I would say that this was the year of consensus and solidarity. There were 91 overtures and a lot of talk ahead of time about how on earth the Overtures Committee and then the other committees and the Assembly as a whole was going to get through all of that material. And I have a feeling that that massive amount of work was a catalyst for some careful planning ahead of time that made for a very smooth assembly and overall some very collegial and cooperative handling of business.
Yeah, I heard the word collegial so many times throughout the week.
Yes, so did I. It was very true. It was a really good reflection of what that week was like. The Overtures Committee is not live streamed, so there's no recording to link to, but Ruth and I did sit through over 14 hours of Overtures Committee on Monday and Tuesday, and I did try to keep up a rough, fast-paced summary on X as it was happening. And then I've created a post that links to those summaries, so you can follow that a bit if you're interested in diving in a little deeper. But before we get into that, Ruth, just what were your reflections? You've seen some of General Assembly, but this was your first time sitting through the Overtures Committee meeting. What did you think?
Well, for all that I've heard about the church process and just how official it sounds, it actually was pretty laid back. Felt casual. I was just sitting in there observing and people were walking in and out. And it just felt like everybody there they just showed up to get something done. I just didn't notice a whole lot of tension.
Yeah, you're right. It was very cooperative and, people during votes or in between votes would walk back and forth and huddle and meet up and make arrangements and agreements. Again, just it seemed like guys who knew they had a lot of work to do and they were serious about getting it done the best way possible. Ordinarily, a few of the experienced members of the Overtures Committee come to day one prepared with a proposed docket to help organize and streamline things, and This year, the proposed docket was divided into 3 tiers, kind of organizing the overtures, starting with what they perceived to be the most important ones to address in Tier 1. And this docket was immediately adopted without any debate. The first thing the Overtures Committee did was they dealt with some overtures related to declarations of thanksgiving and requests for prayer that were pretty easily agreed upon. And then they moved on to a large collection of overtures related to the roles of women in the church. Now, roughly speaking, there were kind of 2 sets of overtures related to women. Some would grant more latitude in that area, including there was even an overture that would allow individual churches to decide if they would ordain women as deacons. And then there were some overtures that would propose to put more restrictions in place related to the titles or the duties that could be assigned to women or to other non-ordained church members. And the general attitude in the Overtures Committee seemed to be that neither type of overture, either the expanding or the restricting kind, were likely to gain broad consensus. The author of the overture proposing to allow women's ordination to the office of deacon was actually granted the floor. Even though he wasn't a member of the Overtures Committee, they voted to allow him to speak, and he spoke about his proposal, but then it was defeated without really any debate. And right after that, a member of the Overtures Committee made a motion that all of the other overtures that related to women's roles in the church be answered with reference to that overture. So basically that means however the General Assembly votes on that one, we are going to answer all the rest in the same way. And with the exception of 2 overtures that were removed, that motion was approved. So almost all of those overtures were handled all together. And the Overtures Committee also approved a very simple statement of grounds. Basically, whenever the Overtures Committee decides against an overture, they have to explain why they did that so that the Assembly at large understands their reasoning. And the statement of grounds that they adopted was basically just, hey, we think that the PCA Constitution is already clear on the office of deacon.
Something that confused me as a first timer, I guess, was I wondered why a presbytery would want to put through an overture like Overture 37 that it seemed very clear would be voted off very quickly. What would be the purpose of that if it didn't seem likely to succeed?
Yeah, that's a great question. I wondered about that too. I don't know if the author of the overture suspected that maybe there would be more support for it at General Assembly.
Hmm.
Or it's possible that he just thought, well, this is the way we get a conversation started. We put the overture out there and people start discussing it. The author did go on a couple of podcasts and things to talk about it. So maybe he knew it wouldn't pass, but he saw this as kind of the first round of stirring up discussion. Not sure, but you're right. I wondered the same thing too. Did he really think this would pass? What was the game plan? There were 2 other items that were removed from that bundle motion, and one overture that was removed and handled separately proposed to require sessions to record the members of their session and the members of the diaconate, and that would just make that information available to the presbytery each year as it reviews the records of the sessions. The Overtures Committee did recommend that that overture be approved. The other overture that was removed was Overture 61, and that was the one that asked the PCA to affirm the Danvers Statement, which was written by the Council on Biblical Manhood and Womanhood, as a biblically faithful statement. And also for this overture, a non-member of the Overtures Committee was given permission of the floor to speak, and that was Ligon Duncan, who was a former board member for the Council for Biblical Manhood and Womanhood. He was granted the floor, and he spoke about the importance of affirming this statement. He mentioned the importance of showing solidarity with other denominations that also affirm this statement. And the Overtures Committee did recommend in the affirmative, but by a very small majority. So it was a vote of 66 to 64, with 3 abstaining. On Monday afternoon, the Overtures Committee voted to recommend in the affirmative that the General Assembly approve a study committee on AI, and then they recommended that the Assembly not approve a study committee on critical race theory. There was also a lot of debate on Overture 27, and that was an overture which proposed to make changes to a portion of the Book of Church Order about how presbyteries could ask the Standing Judicial Commission, the highest court, to take over a case from a presbytery if that presbytery was not acting on it. And in the end, the Overtures Committee did recommend that it be approved, but this was after there was a significant amount of amendments that were made to the language, and it really changed it substantially from the original overture. On Tuesday morning, the Overtures Committee voted to recommend in the negative or refer back to Presbytery quite a number of overtures. And then in the afternoon, the committee addressed Overture 81, which proposed to require wine in addition to grape juice be served during communion at General Assembly worship services. And some of the concerns that were raised really were about like the financial or logistical aspects. If they made this a requirement, what would happen if that was cost prohibitive, or what if it was held in a city where the assembly hall would not allow wine to be served, or what about children participating? And so eventually they significantly amended the language of the overture, and what resulted was essentially a request that the General Assembly write a letter to the Administrative Committee just conveying that this is important and that if possible, we would like for wine to be served at communion as well as grape juice.
Mm-hmm. You know, it's funny, the committee was pretty efficiently getting through the 91 overtures we had to do, and of all the overtures that we had to work through, this was the one they got hung up on the most.
Yeah, it was really interesting. And the amendments went in several different directions, voting on certain things, taking out certain things back and forth. And then in the end, they wound up with almost a completely different overture. But yeah, it was one of the ones that they spent the most time debating. So that was a surprise, not on my bingo card for General Assembly this year. The committee also voted to recommend in the affirmative for Overture 43, which was the overture that would change the length of terms for the stated clerk and the coordinators of the program committees from 1 year to 4 years. And right after they voted to recommend in the affirmative, then a group announced their intention to file a minority report regarding that decision on Overture 43. By Tuesday afternoon, the time for the Overtures Committee was drawing short because the time for the opening worship service of General Assembly was getting closer and closer. And so finally, someone made a motion to take all 24 remaining overtures and just refer them back to the presbyteries. And after some wrangling this way and that way, eventually 22 of them were referred back and 2 were just flat out answered in the negative. So Tuesday evening was the first business meeting of General Assembly, which means that's when the live stream began. It starts after worship on Tuesday evening, and during this meeting, the Assembly elected Melton Duncan as the moderator for the week, and they also approved the Administrative Committee's nomination of Fred Greco as the new stated clerk for the PCA. The Assembly also voted on 10 amendments to the Book of Church Order that were approved by last year's General Assembly and then approved by at least 2/3 of the presbyteries in the intervening year. And out of those 10, 9 of them passed. The one that did not pass related to sending digital transcripts from Standing Judicial Commission cases to the presbyteries for review in the case of an SJC minority report. That's actually extremely rare. And my understanding is it's never happened in the history of the PCA, but one of the speakers who spoke against this amendment pointed out that having digital copies of the transcript, not just the report of the SJC, but the whole record of the case, all of the transcripts, all the witness testimony, having all that sent out in digital format could increase the risk for sensitive information to be leaked. And so that amendment did ultimately fail. The other amendment that was pulled out for individual discussion but did pass related to administrative suspension of a teaching elder who is awaiting trial. So the amendment, which now is actually officially binding, requires that the 2/3 vote necessary to administratively suspend must be taken by the presbytery as a whole and not just by a judicial commission. Tuesday evening business also included an update from the study committee on the directory for worship. As I've mentioned before, their report is out and it's available to read, but they will not make their final presentation until next year's General Assembly. There are some logistical and parliamentary obstacles to consider relating to how they would pass such a large portion of the Book of Church Order at one time without every bit of it being debated and amended and all that.
It was actually lovely to see Mr. Melton Duncan elected moderator because you and I, the night right before his election, had a lovely conversation with him. He was actually very kind in answering my questions about GA and all that. It was lovely.
It was lovely. It was a nice discussion. On Wednesday morning, the Review of Presbytery Records Committee gave their report, and most of their recommendations passed without any debate. Again, you just definitely got the sense that the Assembly was working hard to be very efficient and use their time well. There were a few items that were pulled out for individual consideration, and so there were some interesting debates about paedocommunion, images of Jesus used for teaching and art, and participation in the Lord's Supper by people who weren't present for the sermon. That was a new one to me. I had not heard that discussed before. And then there was also some debate about whether the PCA could legitimately dismiss a pastor to be a clergy member in the Episcopal Church and whether that counted as a true branch of the visible church. Just after we got back from lunch on Wednesday, the Study Committee on Christian Nationalism gave a preliminary report. They've finished some sections of their report and have released those for review and feedback as they continue to work for the upcoming year, and they plan to make their final report to the 2027 General Assembly.
I was actually sad to miss the preliminary report on Christian nationalism. I was at Duncan at the time.
Yeah, girl's got to have her coffee.
Mm.
It was a good report, and one of the things that I found encouraging was that Dr. Strain, who was presenting the preliminary report, made note of the fact that although there's a broad swath of different folks who might use the term Christian nationalism and it might mean different things to different people, there definitely is an ugly thread of just some like really crude and completely un-Christ-like behavior and speech that has woven its way into some of these Christian nationalist circles. And it was encouraging that he pointed out specifically racism and kinism, but also misogyny. And I was actually thankful that that was addressed too. Of course, racism and kinism are important and probably are going to be at the forefront of the report on Christian nationalism, as they should. But it really is true that some super unhealthy views of women and discussion about women and even treatment of women publicly has been a part of these debates and these discussions. So I was really thankful to hear that addressed specifically and directly during General Assembly. During the Mission to North America report, there was some debate over one of the overtures that proposed to divide one presbytery into two, and the objections seemed mostly to center around the lack of a clear consensus in the presbytery. Apparently, the vote on this overture was somewhat close. This is actually the first time I've ever seen debate on an overture about presbytery boundaries changed. So that was interesting. During the report from Covenant College, the Assembly debated an overture that proposed to limit teaching of Bible classes to only ordained elders in NAPARC. NAPARC is North American Presbyterian and Reformed Churches. After debate, this overture was eventually defeated.
You know, with this overture, when I was reading over it, I didn't originally register what this was. But during debate at GA, I realized that this was a debate about women teaching Bible classes at Covenant College.
Yeah, that's true. I think maybe this is the one time during General Assembly when there was really some debate and discussion about women's roles in serving the church. And one of the points that was made was that we really need to distinguish between church and ordained office in the church versus a college, which is an institution. It's not the church.
Mm-hmm.
The first item on the docket for Thursday morning was the Administrative Committee report, and there were a number of recommendations there that were debated. A few years ago, the registration fee for ruling elders was reduced to about half of that for teaching elders, and that was done in the hopes of increasing ruling elder participation in General Assembly. Ordinarily, there are a lot fewer ruling elders that participate, and so I think they were hoping that if they lowered the registration fee, perhaps they could regain some of the balance between ruling elder and teaching elder participation. And apparently it has come up some, but there have been debates about, well, did that participation increase because the fee was lowered, or did it increase because there were issues up for debate and voting on that people were concerned about. And so they're trying to send more ruling elders. But whatever the case, also costs have been increasing for the assembly. And I believe the assembly has actually been operating in the red for a few years. So they felt like returning that registration fee to the original rate was going to be important just to continue to cover costs. And there were a number of folks who stood up and spoke and said things like that their church helped to pay for the registration fee or maybe the travel fees for ruling elders. And the administrative committee also reminded folks that there are actually scholarships for anybody who wants to participate in General Assembly who might be prohibited by cost. There were also recommendations to extend the work of the two ongoing study committees, one on the Directory for Worship and then one on Christian nationalism. There was some debate about the Christian Nationalism Committee, but ultimately they both were approved for another year. Before the assembly broke for lunch on Thursday, Guy Waters, the chairman of the Overtures Committee, presented what he called a roadmap for navigating the Overtures Committee report. And it contained several sets of omnibus votes that would enable voting on overtures in large groups instead of individually. And several of the first few bundles included recommendations that had passed the Overtures Committee with significant majority votes. So it was unlikely that there was going to be a lot of dissension from the assembly as a whole. So right after lunch on Thursday, the assembly dove into voting on all of those overtures. And just before they did, Fred Greco, the newly elected stated clerk of the PCA, addressed the assembly to remind them that if the Overtures Committee has recommended any form of no on an overture, there essentially is not a way for that overture to be approved at that General Assembly. So if the Overtures Committee recommends in the affirmative, then the assembly can defeat it with a no vote. But if the Overtures Committee recommends in the negative or recommends that it be referred back to Presbytery, defeating that recommendation basically just sends it back to the Overtures Committee, which means it's going to have to be handled by next year's Overtures Committee, because at that point, we were almost done with General Assembly. The Overtures Committee was not going to meet again. So Fred Greco essentially wanted to remind folks, if there's an overture that the Overtures Committee has recommended be answered in the negative, but you really wanted it to pass, pulling it out of the omnibus to debate it is not in any way going to be able to result in passing it this year. So just keep that in mind with all the overtures that we have to address. After that talk, the assembly really did pass large swaths of overtures in omnibus at record speed. The first overture that saw some debate on the floor of General Assembly was Overture 43, because that one had a minority report. And so that was pulled out to be handled on its own. The Overtures Committee had officially recommended in the affirmative, which would change the stated clerk and coordinator's terms from 1 year to 4 years. The minority report recommended that the overture be defeated, which would leave the terms at 1 year. And ultimately, the minority report did win out, so the overture was defeated, and the terms will remain at 1 year terms, at least for now.
Of all the overtures that were discussed at General Assembly, the debate for this overture was, to me, the most engaging and informative. There was just a lot of information I hadn't thought about, like a 4-year term might go along with a bit less accountability to the assembly, as opposed to a 1-year term where the assembly would have the opportunity to weigh in sort of checks and balances. On the other hand, we want stability for the stated clerk or coordinators, especially if their family is moving out to Atlanta for potentially just a 1-year term. Some debaters were also saying that whoever was elected as a coordinator should see this position as a service to the church and should just put it in God's hands, trust him.
Yeah, one of the things that was really meaningful to me to hear was somebody pointed out, which is true, that, in the 50 plus years of the PCA's history, every single person who's ever served in any of these roles has always served a 1-year term and then been reelected year after year after year. L. Roy Taylor, who was a founding father of the PCA and was the stated clerk from, I think, 1998 to 2020. So he served 22 years, but he was reelected every year. So it doesn't have to be a 1-year job. And I suppose stability hopefully would come from a man performing his duties well and with cooperation and good leadership with his team.
I think possibly this overture was a solution where there wasn't a problem.
Yes, well said. And we heard that sometimes too, a solution in search of a problem. Overture 37 was the one that proposed to allow each church to decide if they would ordain women deacons, was pulled out of omnibus for individual discussion as well. The author of this overture came to the mic to share supporting reasons, and he said these were additional things that were not included in the rationale of the overture. After debate, this overture was eventually defeated.
I did initially wonder why a presbytery might want to put an overture through to GA if they knew it was going to fail. And perhaps a good reason to is even if you don't think it will pass, you do have an audience of the entire General Assembly for that year. Maybe the author knew that the overture would fail, but he did still get his 3 minutes of topic clock time to talk to GA about it.
Yeah, that might be true. And I do feel like I noticed some people as they were speaking, watching the mic clock on the big screens that were up there to keep track of how much time they had as they were talking. As I mentioned before, Overture 27 was significantly amended in the Overtures Committee. The author of the overture raised concerns on the floor of General Assembly about the new language and whether that would either make it virtually impossible for presbyteries to request that the SJC take over a case or lead to an unhelpful dissemination of information in order to be able to reach that threshold of a petition from 20% of the presbyteries, which that would be about 17 or 18 presbyteries. Ultimately, the overture did pass as amended, so we'll see what the presbyteries do with that during the year. There also was debate about the Danvers Statement on the floor of the Assembly, and that debate really very closely mirrored the debate that had already taken place in the Overtures Committee. Ligon Duncan once again spoke about the importance of affirming this statement, while others expressed concerns about the connection to Trinitarian heresy, the overemphasis on authority, submission, hierarchy as a very narrow view of men's and women's roles, and the fact that this statement really would not have any binding impact on the denomination. The overture once again passed by a pretty narrow margin. It was 934 to 841, with 34 abstaining. And although I was hopeful ahead of time that this overture would not pass, as I shared on the previous podcast episode, there actually were a few things about this discussion that I was really thankful for. First, I think some of the speeches against were very articulate, and I was encouraged, especially by a gentleman from my own presbytery who had some wise words to share. Also, Ligon Duncan made a point in his speech to repudiate the Trinitarian heresy of eternal subordination of the Son. Not that I suspected that he held to that view, but it was just good that that was specifically mentioned on the live stream at General Assembly as clearly out of bounds of orthodoxy. And he also pointed out that in this moment in culture, it's important that the Danvers Statement, we think of it as pushing back against egalitarianism or mutualism. But he pointed out that it does speak against what he called hyper-masculine patriarchy. And once again, I'm thankful that there is an acknowledgement of this as a problem in our circles, or at least in adjacent circles.
I'm thankful that even though it was approved, it doesn't really carry much weight, because all this means is that a slight majority of one General Assembly, quote unquote, affirmed it as a biblically faithful statement.
Right. Yeah, I think when I did the math, it was basically like a 52% vote. So we knew ahead of time that whatever the outcome, this vote would essentially just represent the opinion of one assembly. And as it turned out, it was a pretty slight majority of one assembly. There was some debate on Overture 66, which called for the declaration of Thanksgiving on the occasion of the 250th birthday of the United States. But probably the most memorable speech of the assembly was given during this debate by a PCA teaching elder who was a Taiwanese immigrant, and he shared his thankfulness for America. I will not spoil it for you because you should go listen to it, but it has since been dubbed the American Cheeseburger Speech, and I'm going to link directly to it in the show notes. I think you'd love it.
But don't take our word for it, because the moderator of General Assembly thanked Mr. Lee for his speech in a very politically correct way.
Yes, he was very careful to not break the rules of parliamentary procedure in his role as moderator, but he did thank Mr. Lee for the speech. And finally, in alignment with the Overtures Committee, the Assembly also approved the Study Committee report on AI and voted against the Study Committee report on critical race theory. And every year, General Assembly ends with the a cappella singing of Psalm 133. You can hear it in the live stream, but it's just not the same as being there in person. It's really quite beautiful to listen to. It's quite beautiful to be there in the assembly hall as it is being sung. And I did find a video on social media that I'll link to of someone who recorded from the floor, which is a little bit better reflection of what it was like to be there, but it's still just not the same thing as being there in person. So, Ruth, what was it like attending a whole week of General Assembly?
It was a lot, but it was wonderful. It was especially cool to hang out with two of our church's elders and our pastor and discuss overtures and other things with them. I think, as flawed as our denomination can be, it was just very encouraging to go to General Assembly and see the church sort of in motion and see the community of people from all across North America fellowshipping together.
Yeah, I agree. It really was encouraging. I admit, I went into General Assembly with some anxiety. I was particularly worried about the potential for contentious debates about women and how they should be allowed to use their gifts in the local church. That just really did not happen at all. And, speaking of our pastor and our elders, we had the opportunity to go to dinner with them on Wednesday night. And we also were joined by one of the missionaries that our church supports. As a matter of fact, Adair Evans, who's been a podcast guest before. So I'll link to her episode in the show notes. That was just pretty cool to get to sit and catch up with her and hear about the work that she's doing. She actually ministers to victims of sex trafficking in Germany. And she also had a friend with her who has done some internship work with MTW and is considering going on the mission field. So that evening really was a blessing.
That was a pretty cool evening, yeah.
Yeah, it was. In reflecting back on General Assembly, it seemed like there was just an unspoken agreement that in order for an overture to be worth the Assembly's time, it needs to be something that is likely to have broad consensus, or at least to be able to gain broad consensus, through the deliberations of General Assembly. Maybe there's a time for proposing something that won't pass, but it might generate enough discussion to lead to a better overture another year. But there just seemed to be a distaste for using overtures to try to push through a personal agenda or to use out an overture as kind of like a referendum on the PCA. Also, just personally, I lost track of the number of people who came up to us and expressed appreciation for the work of Presbyterian Pew or shared that they had church members who found the layperson level explanations helpful.
I had to share my mom this week with about 50 other strangers because people kept walking up to her and thanking her for her work, and it was very cool.
It was pretty cool to be able to do that with you. We took lapel pins and buttons with us, and we handed out all 50 of the buttons we took and almost 75 of the lapel pins. And we have had so many requests from folks who weren't at General Assembly that we've actually added a shop on the Presbyterian Pew website so that you can order some for yourself. And we've also included a few additional items like some mugs and some shirts if you're interested. I've linked to it in the show notes, but it's easy to find. You can just go to presbyterianpew.org/shop.
We actually wore matching shirts from the shop on the first day of General Assembly, and we looked super cute doing it.
I mean, I have to agree. Matching mother-daughter Proverbs 31 shirts were a win. This year was the last year for a while that I'll be able to drive to General Assembly. Next year's assembly is in Milwaukee, and I'm sorry, but I'm not driving from Virginia to Wisconsin. So that means if I'm going to attend, I'm going to need to raise about $2,500 to cover not only lodging and meals, but also plane fare and rental car. So proceeds from the shop will all go towards travel expenses for General Assembly 2027. Also, if you'd like to make a direct tax-deductible donation to the travel expenses, you can do that on the website as well. And for any donation of $25 or more, I'll be happy to send along a pin or a button as a thank you. You can find more details about that in the link in the show notes. And that wraps up season 3 of the podcast. Lord willing, we'll be back in the fall with some new storytellers for season 4. And Ruth, thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. Stories from the Presbyterian Pew is a resource of Advocacy from the Presbyterian Pew, a 501c3 nonprofit. We are 100% volunteer run and 100% donor supported. We want to keep this podcast ad-free, but in order to do that, we need the financial support of listeners like you. To make a one-time or recurring contribution, please visit presbyterianpew.org/donate. If you are interested in learning more about the governing document of the PCA, the Book of Church Order, please check out our free self-paced courses at presbyterianpew.org/courses. And if you have a question about PCA church government or something you have experienced in a PCA church, you can reach out through the form on our website at presbyterianpew.org/contact. Towards hope and healing, I'm Lynna Sutherland with Advocacy from the Presbyterian Pew.